To complement the overview that it was provided with some other legal safeguards around return from yesterday, I speak on my behalf and complementing a little bit what was said about my role. I actually have two main tasks. I advise Frontex on fundamental rights issues on a daily basis. It's mainly focused on operational issues. And I also monitor on the ground. So that means I go to all these operations regularly, including return operations, which is going to be the focus of my presentation. But of course, feel free to ask anything later during the turn of questions. I wanted to focus on returns first because, of course, there was a lot of prior speakers mentioning it, but also because I actually believe that they are the most sensitive operations that Frontex is coordinating. And in my experience, which doesn't mean that I have seen this happening, but it could theoretically be the case, anything can go wrong in really a split of a second. This is the sad truth of the operations. It's highly sensitive environment and in a closed doors, and it's not very easy to manage. Frontex coordinates joint return operations for already 6 years, I believe, and the latest trend has been to start coordinating also readmissions to Turkey, as you probably have heard. I will speak everything I do on my own behalf. I am independent in my functions within Frontex, and therefore I have actually all these views are my own. Doesn't mean that they are attributable to the agency. I will do 3 things. It works. Explain very briefly. I want to restrict my presentation to 10-15 minutes so that you have time for questions. To fundamental rights and Frontex activities, the specifics of joint return operations in the Code of Conduct and Guide on Joint Return Operations that we have just published, and a little bit of an overview on monitoring of return operations, which to me is extremely important matter. What, as Leneke put it, it was quite critical in the press and in the public sphere about the fundamental rights adherence or not of Frontex deployed officers. Therefore, the regulation establishing Frontex was amended in 2011 to introduce the following statement, which actually is quite condensed in terms of fundamental rights. It says, Frontex shall fulfill its tasks, which are to coordinate operations in support of member states' border management activities, in full compliance with Union law, including the Charter of Fundamental Rights, the relevant international law, including the 1951 Convention, obligations related to access to international protection, in particular the principle of non-refoulement, and fundamental rights, which means in my practical daily life, I have resources in the UN, the Council of Europe, and the EU legislation to make a point and defend fundamental rights arguments within the activities. Furthermore, in Article 26, it was amended, including a new paragraph stating that Frontex shall put in place an effective mechanism to monitor the respect of fundamental rights in all the activities. And this is where I come into the picture. I am a tool within that monitoring system with monitoring powers myself. So I'm not the monitoring system in itself, but I'm part of it. Of course, this includes all the activities of Frontex, therefore cooperation, return cooperation is included, and also cooperation with third countries. The fundamental rights obligation in a joint return operation have been discussed extensively with member states and within Frontex and with other EU bodies, and it implies 3 levels of EU. So 3 levels of the legislation. First, of course, the escorts participate in the joint return operations are national escorts, therefore they are obliged by the national law. Then there is the EU law, the Charter of Fundamental Rights for my concern, and then international law and the Return Directive, of course, and international law, the European Convention or the UN treaties. I will try to reduce. What are the main fundamental rights at stake during a return operation? Human dignity, basic needs, of course, freedom from torture and inhuman or degrading treatment. This is normally the most, one of the most endangered ones. Non-discrimination, right to life, right to an effective remedy, and protection of vulnerable persons. The right to effective remedy was very extensively explained yesterday, so I will not stay on that one. I will just focus on what the Code of Conduct and the guide say about some specifics. The Code of Conduct describes common procedures for joint return operations coordinated by Frontex and tries to include as much as possible procedures to ensure return in a humane manner and with full respect on fundamental rights. For instance, Article 4 of this code states that the return operation can be interrupted or terminated in case of unsafety or serious violations of fundamental rights. This has not been the case yet, but at least that since my start in Frontex 3.5 years ago, but I mean, it's not, of course, it has to be contemplated as a possibility that there is such a massive situation that the operation needs to be actually aborted. And one of the most sensitive points, of course, during these operations are the use of coercive measures and to what extent and when and what type of coercive measures. The Code of Conduct says that the use is only when strictly necessary. It actually invites for an individual risk assessment of the need of coercive measures. Its use has to be proportional and with reasonable force, and they are forbidden to use measures that can provoke asphyxia or the use of sedatives during return operations. The Code also obliges to report all violations of the Code, including any issue related to fundamental rights by the persons participating on it. And for this purpose, okay, we developed further, there was a guide on joint return operations. I think it was drafted in 2008, and of course with all the evolution on case law and all the return directive and everything, we thought it was time to revise it. We have been on this exercise for quite a while. And we just published it. I don't have copies. I have copies of the Code of Conduct. I left them outside. The guide is available in the webpage of Frontex. It was actually published on the webpage only last week, and we hope to be able to distribute hard copies soon. The purpose of the guide is to provide more operational guidance, not so much behavioral ones, but operational, how to organize joint return operations by air, coordinated by Frontex. And there's we did quite an extensive consultation during this process with member states, with the Consultative Forum on Fundamental Rights, which is the advisory body on Frontex on fundamental rights, composed of 15 members, and the Committee of the Prevention of Torture of the Council of Europe. For instance, in this guide we have a specific aspects related to embarkation and the treatment of minors during flights. This means families, not unaccompanied minors. This is one of the bans that the operational plans of joint operations imposes. There are no unaccompanied minors in Frontex flights, to my knowledge, that I have, and is forbidden. And we have tried to enhance a lot the presence and the work of medical doctors during these operations, of course, in view of ensuring the right to health of everybody on board. The content is a little bit explained there. One matter that I have worked a lot these last weeks is actually the fact that I firmly believe that operationally and from a fundamental rights perspective, there is absolutely no difference between among the fundamental rights safeguards that a joint operation, joint return operation by plane normally, prototypically will imply, and a readmission operation that is now undertaken with Turkey. They are the same type of operation when it comes to looking into what safeguards you need to have there. Of course, legally they are very different, but from a fundamental rights perspective and the needs of the people inside, I don't see any. So I'm trying to work towards the direction of using the guide and using the code of conduct in these operations. And I go with the last point on monitoring. You probably all know that the Return Directive established the need for member states to provide for an effective monitoring system of return operations. This is likely to be one of the most debated aspects of the Return Directive in its history, and there are very good reasons for it. What is effective? Is it independent? You know, there has been a lot of evolution in this front, and I have followed it with great interest, because in some, the importance of monitoring system is not only for the returnees, it's also for everybody on board. Of course, it actually aims to ensure that people are returned in a humane manner and with full respect of fundamental rights, observing the standards that have been set up by the EU Return Directive itself, all the case law, and the Committee for the Prevention of Torture. It adds transparency and accountability to the operations, but it also ensures the safety and the protection not only of the returnees but also of the escorts, because there have been incidents where escorts were actually injured in practice. The new regulation that was discussed yesterday includes a specific system of complaints, individual complaints. It was briefly mentioned yesterday, and of course the return operations are going to be part of that complaint mechanism. It also includes the establishment of a pool of monitors by Frontex, which I'm not entirely sure what is the latest development in this, but in the version of the Commission it was members of the national monitoring mechanisms that were going to be kind of seconded to the Frontex pool in order to be able to ensure presence of a monitor in all the Frontex flights. There is a basic standard and rights of monitors during this flight. Monitors access to information prior to the flight, during the pre-embarkation meeting. They participate in the briefings. The possibility, there was foreseen in the Code of Conduct, the possibility for a member state to monitor on behalf of another member state. This actually was put in the theory, but it was never implemented. And now with this pool, that is going to actually have to happen, because that's exactly the point of a pool. There will be one monitor and not one per country. There is also the possibility for observers to be on board. This has been 3 times already the case of the Committee of the Prevention of Torture. They have monitored 3 member states organizing flights, but it was Frontex coordinated. And there was also foreseen in the Code of Conduct the reporting and sanction mechanism, but now with the complaints it will be effectively put out in the public. I have tried to actually do something else during my time in Frontex, which is to include in this equation of monitoring the monitoring upon arrival. This has been not systematically done, only for certain countries where the national preventive mechanism of torture was especially active, for instance in the area of the Western Balkans. And what we try to do is notify the Ombudsman that the flight is coming, so that they can actually receive the people and have an initial interview assessing vulnerabilities already before people are taken to wherever it is that they are returning to, normally their homes. And well, in a nutshell, a monitoring system in Frontex I always draw it as a graphic in a circle that illustrates what could happen in case of an incident. There is, of course, information, verification of the information. This is always done by the member state involved. Frontex doesn't have investigative powers. Then what I perform is the analysis of the information and the impact on fundamental rights, and then we do a final report where I try to, of course, to put forward some measures for follow-up in order to prevent similar incidents in the future, and then we go again to the beginning of the prevention. And for instance, one of the things we have done is when I have observed certain procedural aspects of I will give you a very concrete example. Embarkation of children and families in different member states was done in different ways. And of course, from a fundamental rights perspective, there was one preferred to the other. And I put it forward in a discussion with member states, and everybody agreed that it was very easy to be implemented in practice. That, for instance, when you have families, you don't put them in the same bus as you have detainees that are actually handcuffed. And they were separated embarkation in different seats in different places, areas of the plane, and then children do not need to actually be exposed to possible episodes of violence when there are other types of profiles in the same flight, for instance. And this was quite easily undertaken by all the people involved. So I will leave it here, and I'm more than ready to get your questions. Thank you very much.